The Tower of London throughout history has been a remarkably tough medieval and Tudor prison to break out of. It's considered one of the most notorious execution sites in history, but also a place where torture and justice was administered with brutality and savagery at times. One of the most shocking stories to emerge from the Tudor period was of a woman who managed to coerce her guard inside the fortress to help her escape. But the story of Alice Tankerville led to the executions of not just one person, but three, and one of them was a Beefeater or a Yeoman Warder, who was supposed to be on guard. Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of Alice Tankerville, and remember as always to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Henry VIII in October 1531 dispatched a group of men to London docks, and they believed they were awaiting to collect a shipment of 366 gold crowns, which had been sent to England from Europe. This money would help the king's depleted treasury and wealth, and this was around £100,000 in today's money. But when the boat arrived, the group found out that the iron chest that the gold had been transported on, which was supposedly secured to the floor of the ship and kept under guard, had disappeared. A huge search was launched to find the thieves, and around 2 years later, suspicion fell on John Wolfe. Wolfe was a thug and a brute, and he actively engaged in acts of piracy, but there wasn't much that specifically linked him to the theft, just his reputation and the fact he was part of the crew on board when the ship arrived at the docks. This was enough to order his arrest, and in summer 1553, Wolfe was sent to the Tower of London. He was charged with theft and treason, and also conspiracy, and these crimes would have certainly indicated that he would have been executed during the reign of King Henry VIII. At the Tower of London, John's wife, a lady named Alice Tankerville, visited him almost daily. She was considered flirtatious and a charmer, and she became very friendly with two of her husband's jailers or guards, Yeoman Warders, William Dennis and John Bawd. The two saw her as lovely and charming, and they allowed her to bring food and even wine into the tower for her husband, and the jailers also enjoyed her gifts. After being imprisoned for 6 months, John Wolfe was let free and released as his trial collapsed due to a lack of evidence, and if he was smarter, he would have left England and exiled himself. Wolfe instead went to Ireland for a short while, and he asked Beefeater John Bawd to look after Alice, his wife, for a short time, but Bawd was already in love with Alice Tankerville. Whilst her husband was away, Alice found out about new evidence linking her husband to the king's missing gold, and Alice was considered an accomplice, and with this she was held under suspicion. Wolfe had disappeared seemingly, and his wife was left to face any punishment. But to avoid wasting time, Alice Tankerville and her husband were tried in absentia, despite Alice being in London still. She was known for regularly visiting the Tower of London, and specifically John Bawd, and she didn't really know much about the developments in the case. However, the husband and wife were sentenced to death for treason, and Alice was formally arrested in February 1534. She was thrown inside of a windowless cell at the tower, inside of the Cold Harbour Tower, and there was hardly any natural light, only through a thick barred window in the heavy oak cell door. Each day her hands and feet were kept shackled in chains, and she was secured to the wall, and she was forced to wait as her husband needed to be captured. Alice was treated very harshly. The lieutenant of the tower did agree to remove her chains, as long as the cell door and the outer door of the Cold Harbour Tower was to be kept locked and shut at all times. But one of her guards tasked with looking after her was her old friend William Dennis. He was worried about how she was being treated, and he brought her a number of gifts. But Dennis was later fired for this, but she still had John Bawd, the beefeater who was falling in love with her, and she could rely upon him. The two spoke through the cell door, and it's believed they ended up having a relationship. This allegedly then became romantic between the guard and the prisoner, but together the pair would come up with an escape plan. Alice was told by John Bawd of a possible escape route from the Cold Harbour Tower to the tower's walls, and John Bawd agreed to help her. He was overwhelmed by his love for Alice Tankerville, and he managed to get a copy of the key for her cell and the tower, and he hid it. Alice was passed the key along with a rope and a stick, and she then hid them until they came up with a final plan. They waited for 2 weeks until it was a new moon, and that night John Bawd helped Alice Tankerville to escape the Tower of London. At 10 p.m. the guard on duty left, and Alice began to break herself out of the tower. She lifted the pin locking herself inside the tower off its hinge, and unlocked the door, and then quietly snuck out of the Cold Harbour Tower. She went through some alleyways and then towards the stone steps leading to a flat roof above Traitor's Gate. Here John Bawd was waiting for her on the roof of St Thomas's Tower, and he tied a rope to an iron hook, and as the night watch passed their round on the street, they decided to make a break for it. John Bawd himself was highly respected, and he knew when the scheduled guards would be in certain areas of the Tower of London. The pair slid down the rope and then landed on a small wharf opposite Traitor's Gate. They untied a small boat used to take prisoners into the tower and then crossed the moat quietly. The guard and prisoner had almost done it. They walked up the grass verge and near to a road where cottages were lived in by guards of the tower. John had hired some horses, and then the pair would hide out at his friend's house following their escape. This is what he hoped would happen, and then the pair would be allowed to start their new lives together, but this did not occur. They made their way around one of the final corners near to where the horses were, and then they were confronted by a group of men who carried lanterns coming in the opposite direction. The two huddled together and tried to conceal their identity, and Bawd knew these were the Night's Watch. They were ahead of schedule and should not have been at this part of Tower Hill at this time. He recognised they were 10 minutes early, and one of the guards, an old friend of John's, named Charles Gore, recognised him and waved. Bawd replied quietly, and they tried to continue, but Gore also had been a guard of Alice Tankerville, and he recognised her. The guards then grabbed John Bawd and Alice Tankerville. It was clear their escape attempt had failed, and with this horrific justice was applied to both of them for their crimes of escaping. Alice was dragged back to her cell, where a new padlock was placed on her door, and she was kept under 24-hour guard at all times. But John Bawd, who had been an esteemed guard, was now taken away for questioning, and he was a prisoner. He was tortured, it's believed, on the rack, and he confessed everything, saying that he betrayed his livelihood out of love for Alice, and was driven to help her escape by love. But things would get worse, as at the time news reached the lieutenant of the Tower that Alice's husband John Wolfe had been captured, trying to return to England, and now all three would pay the heavy price for their crimes. John Bawd was holed up inside of Little Ease, an oubliette-style cell in the dungeon of the White Tower, and he would have been forced to crouch over all day. The cell was so small you could not sit down or stand, and this would have been very tough mentally and physically, but things got much worse for ex-guard John Bawd. Alice Tankerville and her husband John Wolfe, for stealing from the king on the 31st of March 1534, were given a pirate's death. The pair were taken from the tower to the stone retaining wall lining the embankment of the River Thames. They were then secured in chains and were lowered into the water at low tide. But as the tide crept in and the water level in the Thames rose, the pair inch by inch were drowned by the river. The dirty water of the Thames covered their legs, then their waists and chests, before they were then drowned, and they could not hold their head above water any longer. This would have been a tragic and horrific death, with Tankerville and Wolfe left pondering this for a number of hours. But for the ex-guard John Bawd, he was brutalised by a number of his former Beefeater colleagues. For his role in helping Alice escape, he was racked further until his muscles tore, bones popped, and arms and legs dislocated. He was a broken man, and then was thrown over the walls of the Tower of London, being hanged in chains and suspended from the fortress. He died slowly from exposure and dehydration, along with his injuries caused by the rack. His body was left to hang for months, and he was then picked at by the ravens and the crows, and this served as a strong reminder of Henry VIII's justice. The story of Alice Tankerville and John Bawd is one of a love story gone wrong. She had fallen in love with a beefeater and a guard at the Tower of London, but then used his knowledge to plan an elaborate escape attempt. It's not known if Bawd was blinded by love or was foolishly used, but what is certain is that the three main characters in this story were all brutally executed. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.